friend I had in undergraduate ran around everywhere telling everyone that he didn't care what other people thought of him. I'm like, okay, you want them to think of you as someone who doesn't care what other people think of them.
Consumerism is definitely driven by a need for recognition. Think about how devastating it is when the person you love passionately doesn't return your love. Rousseau was driven from France. His books were burned. He was desecrated publicly. He had to search for a place in Europe where he could live.
Maintaining self-esteem in the absence of all external valuation is an impossibility. Why is that? As an undergraduate, I was obsessed with what people thought of me. I was obsessed with chasing the next shiny thing, and that was not a fulfilling life. Fortunately, I was a student of Fred Neuhouser's, who's one of the top scholars on Rousseau's idea of Amour-Propre, the desire for recognition. Rousseau's philosophy wrestles with just how much we do is motivated not by the activity itself, but by winning respect and esteem through the activity. In my case, Amour-Propre led me to rack up achievements I didn't need, to pursue careers I didn't want, all in order to impress people I didn't particularly like. And as soon as I learned about all the havoc that Amour-Propre was wreaking on my life, I did perhaps what any hasty young man would have done. I tried to renounce it completely. I switched from computer science to philosophy. I deleted all of my social media. I moved to Nepal to practice in a Tibetan monastery. But Neuhouser also rescued me from this extreme. He showed me that it's not possible nor desirable to get rid of Amour-Propre, because caring what others think is responsible for many good things in life. Romance, virtue, reason, communal life itself would be impossible without it. The question then is not how do I stop caring, but it's how, from whom, and when should I care? The question is how do I align external validation with intrinsically meaningful pursuits? This is one of the most important lessons that Professor Neuhouser taught me and will also teach you today. So let's begin by understanding Amour-Propre and its complement, Amour de Soi. Amour-Propre, Amour de Soi. Can you give us a gentle introduction to the central distinction that you read in Rousseau?
Sure, I can try. Amour de Soi is the kind of self-love we first think of when you hear the word self-love or self-interestedness, and it means that you are more interested in your well-being than you are in the well-being of other people, that your well-being is especially important to you. Paradigm instances of what self-love is after would be things like food, sleep, necessary shelter, clothing, and so on and so forth. That kind of self-love is not so hard to understand. The other kind of self-love that Rousseau thinks is very different is what he calls Amour-Propre. And Amour-Propre is basically a drive, Rousseau calls it a passion that we have as human beings to seek what you might call esteem or respect from other people. Rousseau sometimes says Amour-Propre leads us to seek the good opinion of others, the favorable opinion of others, so approval and all kinds of things that fit under the category of esteem and respect.
So we're already painting a very intersubjective, social view of human nature. And what we're trying to win is recognition. Nietzsche tells us that we should read philosophies as intimate confessions by the philosophers themselves. Tell us a bit more about Rousseau's life. Why was he so interested in this topic?
Rousseau personally was obsessed with not being recognized in his life. The famous incident in his Confessions, he was an adolescent working as a servant in an aristocratic family. And Rousseau felt he had been done wrong by his employers because he wasn't included in their will. That's an injury of narcissism. That's an injury of Amour-Propre. And so to get revenge for that, he stole a ribbon from the woman of the house. And when he was discovered, he denied that he stole the ribbon, and blamed it on a poor servant girl in the house who then got punished and dismissed for something. So this is a big incident in Rousseau's life. He comes back to it all the time. But that shows really clearly that there's something about being recognized or being misrecognized that's extremely important to Rousseau. And then in his later years, when Émile and the Social Contract were published, he was driven from France. His books were burned. He was desecrated publicly. He had to search for a place in Europe where he could live. And so he was constantly moving around trying to escape real persecution. And so this issue of not being recognized, it leads him finally to go off to try to live a solitary life. The reveries of a solitary wanderer, or what he wrote to describe this. And he describes very clearly, he tries to get rid of his amour-propre. He tries to not care about the contemptuous looks he thinks he's receiving from people, and he can't do it. He can't do it. So you're right. This was a big issue for Rousseau, the philosopher, too.
This is a theoretical point that I want to emphasize, both in what you talked about in Rousseau being left out of his will, as well as being persecuted, is that when you say people want recognition, it's not that they literally want another person, Professor Neuhouser, here to sit down and say, Jonathan, you're great at Rousseau. There's another world of objects that can mediate this recognition. In the case of the will, it's the lack of a will that shows a lack of maybe belonging to the family that he worked at. And in case of persecution, that's not, prima facie, that's not recognition, but it's a form of disregard for him as an intellectual for France, right? So recognition can be mediated by these objects in all these different ways.
Right, so what you're saying is there's something misleading when Rousseau talks about seeking the good opinion of others, or it leaves something out, which is that the recognition you're seeking is often comes to you in ways other than, the direct expression of a favorable opinion from another person.
And perhaps that's why I was so hesitant about the thesis of your work when I first read it, is because a lot of these mediated routes, right, these ways that aren't direct recognition, they appear to be objects that we desire for their own sake. And maybe even hidden to us, so much more of our lives is mediated by recognition. An example is probably fine dining, right? If you ask people why they like fine dining, no one's gonna say, well, it's because I wanna have a high opinion of myself. But if you've ever tried it, right, the quality of food isn't that much better than just a good meal. And so it's not that amour de soi, it's not appetite that drives us towards fine dining. It's this sense of mediated recognition that we receive. There was a friend I had in undergraduate, and there was a semester where he ran around everywhere telling everyone that he didn't care what other people thought of him. And whenever someone tells me that, I'm like, okay, you do care what people think of you. You want them to think of you as someone who doesn't care what other people think of them. And that's the incredible domain that recognition has in our lives, that so much of it comes even unnoticed to us.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think the fine dining example is a good example of this point that you're making. You can't understand that without bringing into the picture a desire to be seen to have a certain standing. So that's a really basic way of drawing the distinction. But I think in order to get to Rousseau's thought, we need to go a little bit farther, because what's really important to Rousseau is that these two species of self-love have not just different aims, so not just aim of, survival and well-being on the one hand, and respect or esteem on the other hand, but they have different structures. And what Rousseau means by that is that amour-propre is relative, whereas amour de soi is not. And understanding what that means is just very crucial to understanding this distinction for Rousseau. So relative means that amour-propre is relative to other subjects, and it's relative to others in two different ways. One way it's relative is that Rousseau thinks that when we seek esteem, we're always implicitly seeking a kind of standing, a kind of comparative standing in relation to others. The other aspect is that Amour-Propre is relative to other subjects in the sense that I'm looking for some kind of opinion, some kind of respect or esteem from another subject. When I need to satisfy my needs for food or my needs for sleep, that doesn't have to be another person in the world. I can satisfy my need to sleep without there being anyone else there. But Amour-Propre is differently. It requires there to be another subject there who can give a favorable opinion or provide you with esteem or respect.
So the first version of relativity, we can call it measured against others,
right?
Comparative standing. And this is me wanting to stand out from my peers of having a good GPA back in undergrad. But the other one of relativity is measured by others. So it's not only against others, but also by others. It's that recognition itself that's something I'm seeking.
So what you said is right. The thing that I want to make absolutely clear is that to seek a comparative standing is not necessarily to seek to excel in relation to others, because there are forms of seeking a standing that are comparative but equal. So sometimes I just want to be recognized like a human being like all other human beings. And there I'm not seeking to excel, but it's a kind of, but you're right, the seeking to excel, the seeking to be better than others is a really important manifestation of Amour-Propre.
I think there's a further clarification we need to make on this idea of relativity. Let me read you a quote from your book. Hume suggests that esteem of any sort is intrinsically comparative, since the quality that elicits it is always an excellence, some respect in which the esteemed individual stands out from his fellows. What you seem to be suggesting here is that Amour-Propre is not only triggered when I'm after things that are comparative against others, whether that's belonging to a group, I just want to be treated like a human, or I want to excel in my GPA, but even when we seek the recognition of having a specific moral quality or normative quality, like being a good athlete, just framed it like that, I want to be a good athlete.
Right.
That is inherently comparative, is the claim.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, because you might think that if what you're after is just to be a good X or Y.
Good athlete, good bookkeeper.
That you're not comparing yourself to others. And there's a sense in which that's true. There's a sense in which when I'm trying to be the best athlete I can, the best, ping pong player that I can, I'm not thinking directly about being better than someone else. But I think the idea is that built into the idea of a good ping pong player is the idea that I'm better than most. So think about this. We don't esteem people because they are good at walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Right.
Because that's something everyone can do. Well, most everyone can do. And so I think that the idea is that included in these kinds of good things that we strive to be, there is an implicit kind of comparison with others.
I suppose there's another cut we can make in defense of Hume, and that's to say, because it's recognition that you're seeking to be a good X, to be a good firefighter, the only way you're going to win that recognition, that esteem, is if you stand out. So even if you are going after an objective measure, like I want to rescue 15 people from a burning building, if everyone else rescues 25 people, then suddenly you're not the one winning the recognition, right? So that's another pathway in which, even when we're after things that are not comparing against other people, because the recognition is what we're trying to win, we need to stand out. And so it becomes comparative.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. That's a different point from the one I was making, but it seems also really important.
Yeah. Let me quote you another quote from your book. It is possible, and in their best interest, for adults to develop internal sources of esteem that are not susceptible to every fluctuation in the opinions of others. However, maintaining self-esteem in the absence of all external valuation is an impossibility. Why is that? We can make genuine progress towards having a more strong core of self-esteem. So if we can become more, why can't we go all the way? And I'll present one more challenge here. It seems like many of our cultural heroes, be it Nietzsche, be it Martin Luther King, or Martin Luther, or Galileo, all found themselves in this deeply unenviable position of not being able to seek recognition or a similar opinion that they themselves held. And they persisted nonetheless, and only some of them went crazy. Why is recognition something that we have to seek, as strong as you made in this quote?
So Nietzsche did go crazy.
Nietzsche did go crazy, that's right.
And I mentioned in the book that there is a kind of, the person who can maintain a good opinion of himself without that opinion ever being confirmed by anyone else risks madness, because that makes you the sole determinant of the sole judge of your merits. And people aren't reliable judges of their own merits.
So people tend to go crazy if they don't have a certain normative attitude confirmed. And those who don't go crazy are, in some sense, pathological, narcissistic. So we've already given examples. We already talked about how Amour-Propre, perhaps ruined is a strong word, but ruined Rousseau's life. Can you give us a gentle introduction of what are all the different ways that Amour-Propre can go wrong?
So there are so many ways Amour-Propre can go wrong. I think your example of fine dining is an example of trying to find recognition for something that's completely trivial and not important, doesn't reflect values of the sort we should espouse. I know people in academia who genuinely want to be, I don't know, the best philosopher of whatever, their generation maybe. And they want to achieve that by being the best philosopher. But being the best philosopher is something that completely takes over their lives and that crowds out any other forms of, I don't know, taking enjoyment in the world. That's a form of inflamed Amour-Propre. Another one, I want to be the best philosopher of my generation, but what I really want is to be recognized as the best philosopher of my generation. And so my strategy is to appear to be the best. I want people to have a certain opinion of me, and what I'm not first and foremost interested in being the best. So that's where you become more concerned with appearances than with reality. Let me just mention one more. There are so many, but if I'm satisfied with my position only when I'm slightly ahead of my neighbor, and if my neighbor has some of that in him too, then he's going to keep trying to outdo me, which means that I have to keep trying to outdo him. And there just becomes this unending rat race that has no other value, brings nothing more than simply being a little bit higher than the other person. So one thing I talk about is the ability of Amour-Propre to infect every kind of activity. That doesn't have to be something bad. So for example, even if I'm not going to the most expensive restaurants and taking pictures of what I have before me and posting them on social media, when we seek to satisfy our nutritional needs, we're not just seeking a certain number of calories. We want to eat and to be seen by others as eating in a way that we think of as worthy of human beings. So digging in dumpsters is not going to satisfy that requirement. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to eat in a way that's worthy of human beings. there is a danger when amour-propre affects so many areas of our lives.
Right.
But it's infecting, although that's a
Strong word.
strong word, it's infecting many areas of our lives, doesn't necessarily result in something bad, something self-defeating or contrary to our own good. But the danger is there.
You talked about the loss of integrity. Put integrity into the system of amour-propre. What does it mean to have integrity, and what does it mean to lose integrity and be alienated?
So I was thinking of integrity as wanting the good opinion of others so badly that you cease to follow your own judgments about what, let's say, being a good artist is, what it is to do good art, and instead you simply follow the dictates of fashion, of whatever seems to be selling right now in the art market. And that I would describe as a kind of failure of integrity, because you've completely subordinated any independent judgment you might have about what's good, what it's important, how it's important for you to do your art, to the opinions of others that, especially in the example of the art world, is very fickle and is often arbitrary and changes. That I would call a loss of integrity.
What makes all the potential pitfalls of amour-propre that we just described even more potentially dangerous is the strength that it can carry when it becomes inflamed. Why does this meager desire for recognition, sometimes it can even rival and supersede our desire to even stay alive?
So in both cases, the very existence of the self is at issue. In one case, the physical body that's part of ourselves as well. But this is something maybe about the metaphysics of identity or the metaphysics of the self, that the self is the kind of thing for human beings that has an existence in being recognized by others. So when we are completely misrecognized, there's something devastating about that can be described in terms of losing your very self.
I really liked the magnitude that you raised the problem of amour-propre to. It's not just about getting recognition, it's about existence. And it's almost as strong a sense of existence as metaphysical existence, like tables and chairs, this sense of existence we're after. And the one colloquial line that calls to mind is, if it's not on Instagram, did it really happen? So
Yeah.
if I go to Hawaii and I don't take a picture and share it on Instagram, well, did it really happen? Well, the obvious answer is to say, what the hell do you mean? Of course it happened. But this is the type of existence that you're getting at.
Right.
That there's a stronger existence that we may even care even more than the brute fact of going to Hawaii. And that's the social fact of having been recognized as having gone to Hawaii.
So I just finished writing an essay on a film of Ingmar Bergman's. And I spent months doing it. It was completely enjoyable. I loved doing it. But I think there's a really good chance the article won't get published, because it's not, for various reasons, it sort of crosses disciplines and so on. But I often have that feeling with respect to this. There's something like, this essay then seems not to be real if it has no existence apart from, my own head or my own hard drive. It doesn't have a social existence. I hadn't thought about this exactly, but what you suggested was that sometimes the need for recognition might even trump our desire to stay alive. Those are very extreme situations, but you're right, there are such things. So,
Martyrdom.
So Christian martyrdom is technically not for recognition.
Right. Technically.
It's not why you're doing it. I'm thinking of cases where you choose death over the loss of honor. Give me liberty or give me death. There's a certain standing that you want, and that you want to have some reality in the world, and that's more important to you even than continuing to live. I guess I don't know what to say, how to exactly explain that, except to note that it's a real phenomenon. It's been a phenomenon throughout history. And it says something at least about how important it is to us to be recognized. But I think I don't have anything to explain why that can sometimes.
Well, perhaps we've already developed a theoretical explanation, which is that it's existence against existence, right? And sometimes one existence trumps another.
Yeah.
When you're
Yeah.
give me liberty or give me death, you're choosing your social existence over your physical existence. And I mean, the other thing to trace this back to is the foundation of Western civilization in Homer, right? Achilles' famous question that he has to wrestle with. Either I stay here, I fight against the Trojans, my physical body is gone forever, but my name will last. Or I go back home and farm, I will live a healthy life. This is the prophecy that he's told, but no one will remember who Achilles is. And then he makes, of course, the former choice.
So that's exactly the sort of case. I think it's probably more common phenomenon in the ancient world than in the modern world, although it's everywhere in the modern world too. The Ukrainians standing up to the Russians, that's part of it. They know they're going to die. They know they have a very good chance of dying. But there's something more important.
Well, that's interesting that you suggest that Amour-Propre, at least in this variation, is stronger in the ancient world. Because when you said about satisfying our basic needs, I went into the reverse. I thought that the modern world had more and more phenomena being explained by Amour-Propre, because amour de soi is so much easier satisfied in the modern world. Both seem to be true here. So I don't know if we can resolve this tension in any way.
I think that's correct. And I don't think that's necessarily in conflict with the idea that when the two kinds of existence come into conflict, the ancients were more likely than we are to choose the social existence. But maybe that's not even true. The kind of thing I was thinking about was the way consumerism is such an important part of the modern world. The thing that you're going to say back to me, which is of course true, is that consumerism is definitely driven by a need for recognition. So that's an instance in which, Amour-Propre is much more a part of our lives than it was in the. Still, I think there's a sense in which the ancients were more concerned with a certain kind of honor that's more likely to come into conflict with your physical existence than we face in the modern world.
So the temporary resolution is that Amour-Propre does indeed drive more logic in the modern world, but there's a specific species of Amour-Propre, and that's the willingness to die for a certain self-conception that's much more common in the ancient world.
I think that's what I was trying to say, yeah.
Right. So we've talked about all the different ways that Amour-Propre can go wrong. There is a particular way of inflammation that comes to mind when people first hear Amour-Propre, and that's when you want to be the best in a domain. I think it triggers up people's egalitarian tendencies, right? That we should all desire equality. So the common understanding is that good Amour-Propre is when you desire to be equal to others, and bad Amour-Propre is when you desire to be better or the best. But you actually argue that that's not the right distinction. Why is that?
Because I think there are certain forms of wanting to be the best at something, and wanting to be the best even passionately, that are not necessarily inflamed Amour-Propre. So I've been watching a lot of tennis lately, and it's amazing how much of their lives tennis players devote, many of them with the aim of being the best. And I think there are ways of really strongly desiring to be the best that don't constitute inflamed amour-propre. For example, there are tennis players who want to be the best, but when the opponent's ball is called out and it's really in, the tennis player reports that to the referee. So there are standards of fairness there. I want to be the best, but only under these conditions, that the game is played fairly, for example. That's one instance. Another instance might be, I really strongly want to be the best, and I end up never quite making it into the top 10. And coming to accept that without resentment is also a possibility for many, many people have to do that in their lives. And that's a way of keeping the desire to be best in check, so that it doesn't lead you to sort of bad consequences that it could. There's the famous example, you're probably too young for this, but the Olympic ice skaters who both of them wanted to be best, and one of the skaters' strategies was to hire someone to knock off the legs or the knees of the other skater in order to be the best. That's clearly an inflamed version of amour-propre. But most of us don't do that. Also, those players who want to be the best, they provide so much entertainment I don't want to use that word. They make the lives of other people much richer. We get a lot out of watching athletes who perform with a sort of perfection we just can't imagine human beings achieving. And so there are also good things we get from people's wanting to be the best.
So the conditions I'm hearing of what constitutes a healthy amour-propre, even when you want to be the best or better than others, is that first, you need to be praiseworthy as well as be praised. That's to say, when you get esteemed, when you get recognition for doing something, for being recognized as the best or better, you actually need to be the best or better. You have to have the good object before you get the good recognition. If you're the best tennis player, you can desire that recognition, but only after you've actually become the best tennis player. But reading you closely, I think there's also a need to recognize my recognizer. To put in other words, if there's a tennis rookie who thinks that I'm the best tennis player, and I happen to be the best tennis player, that's not as satisfying as if the best tennis judge in the world gives me that same recognition.
So there is involved in my desire for recognition a kind of recognition of that other subject who's giving me the evaluation. I have to be able to see that other subject as having the standing to give me the recognition that I want. We're not going to find satisfying recognition that comes from people who don't know anything about what makes a good tennis player or a good philosopher. Instead, we're going to find satisfying recognition only when we get it from people whom we also recognize as worthy to judge us.
Right. Well, it's interesting because there you framed it as a descriptive point, that we won't get satisfaction from being recognized by someone who's not worthy. In Rousseau, or at least in your book, sometimes it seemed like a normative point, that we can, but we shouldn't. We only should delight in the recognition of someone who's worthy. Which one is the right reading here?
I think both are right. So we do know that there are people who seek recognition from people they know are not worthy of judging them in this particular. And I would call that a form of inflamed amour-propre. And I guess I would say that there is something intrinsically unsatisfying about that. And so it's both a descriptive point and a normative point.
So it's something like this. You can train yourself to desire the recognition of someone who's unworthy. And in our example, let's give the cartoon public intellectual or the cartoon sophist, right? Who's interested in making 3-second Rousseau explainers and about getting recognition from just about anyone. And I think we can, browse social media and have multiple examples of this. And you're saying, look, you can train yourself to have some kind of enjoyment from that, but ultimately you won't get this deep sense of satisfaction that you would from someone who's actually worthy of recognizing your talents.
That's what I was trying to say, yeah.
And it sounds like the second condition of what constitutes a healthy Amour-Propre, even when you want to be the best or better than others, is that when you fail, and in the case of being best, everyone except one person is by definition going to fail, you need to have enough resources, or society needs to provide you with enough resources for you to relinquish that drive of being the best without it ending your life in any strong sense.
Exactly, yeah.
This is also why I very much prefer New York to San Francisco. Because in San Francisco, everything is about tech. There's one singular hierarchy, and your pecking order is determined precisely by where you are in this tech pecking order. And there was times where I couldn't even go surfing. I couldn't even attend a surfing lesson without someone asking me about how much Tesla stock I owned or something like that. Whereas the nice thing about New York is that, well, there's a dominant hierarchy, and that's finance in New York. But there's all these other hierarchies, whether it's art, it's sports, it's intellectual life. And that also sets up a juxtaposition between these different recognitive spheres that makes an agent within them feel much more free. And perhaps one way to explain it is that if you know you fail in one domain, it's not all over. There are these other ways that one can win esteem from one's peers.
Mm-hmm. So San Francisco didn't used to be like that. It's a relatively recent development. But the point you're making, I definitely agree. Maybe that's why I prefer New York too. It also goes back to the point I was making about writing an essay on something I have no real expertise in, is writing this essay on a film of Ingmar Bergman's. It's like, okay, I'm very late in my career, but something about what I've done in my career has given me a sense of esteem, sort of resources of esteem, of self-esteem, so that when this thing never gets published, it's not going to be a devastating thing for me.
So we talked about all these different ways that Amour-Propre can go wrong. Let's talk about why Amour-Propre tends to be inflamed so commonly. Why, in other words, what are the different pathways for its inflammation? Now you drew out two sets of pathways. There's the social political, and there's the, as it relates to upbringing, right, the pedagogical. So let's talk about the social political one first. Increase in productivity, which creates leisure and luxury, division of labor, private property, inequality of wealth. These social political conditions inflame Amour-Propre. Why is that?
I think those are all elements that create new realms of being, where it's possible for the desire to outdo others to take over. Private property, owning wealth, is one easy example because there's a relatively clear metric according to which these things can be judged. And so it's something like private property creates a space, a social space, within which Amour-Propre is free to kind of take over and go wild.
Let me read you a quote that you wrote in your work. In a society that made minimizing the gap between rich and poor a first priority, individuals would be less likely to think of their standing for others as rooted in what or how much they own. They would be less likely, in other words, to confuse the value of things with the value of persons. When I had read this quote, the immediate fear and concern that jumped into my mind is that, what if Amour-Propre is like a hydra?
Is like a hydra.
A hydra, yeah. If you cut off one of its manifestations, it'll just spring up in other ways. Another analogy, perhaps, that's also fitting, is like a leaky water barrel with many holes. You plug one hole, and then it leaks out another. And the story that I call to mind is my father grew up in communism, and he tells me a story where, there was no Amour-Propre around money or private property because it didn't exist. it translated into other domains, some very trivial domains. And one of the most interesting ones was whether you ate bread or rice. That became a mark of status between families. And so the concern is, what if by cutting out wealth inequality, we're just unleashing this in other domains of power? But then I reread Second Discourse and I potentially found an answer. So I'll tell you that and you can tell me what you think. I quote to you Second Discourse. Wealth, rank, power, and personal merit are generally the principal distinctions by which one is measured in society. Of these four sorts of inequality, as personal qualities, this is merit, are the origin of all the others, riches is the last to which they are finally reduced, because, being the most immediately useful to well-being and the easiest to transmit, it can be readily used to buy all the rest. This observation makes it possible to tell rather accurately the extent to which each people has moved from its original institution and how far it has gone toward the ultimate stage of corruption. What I found fascinating about this passage is that it's tracing a almost Platonic degeneration of states, right? From a society that worships personal merit, and I'm using worship very intentionally here to suggest that there is something perverse even about that. So that's how far I can throw a javelin. To a society that worships power, right? That's Sparta, military power. To a society that worships rank, maybe that's Victorian England. To our current modern society now that worships wealth. But he's not saying that these are all the same types of inflammation of Amour-Propre. He's saying that there's a degeneration and it leads to more corruption. And the only hint that he gives us is that this direction is first, the most immediately useful for well-being, and two, easiest to transmit. So this is my interpretation. You can tell me if I'm off base. As you move in this direction, wealth is much more transmutable than personal merit. I can think about life, almost every facet of life, I can reduce it down to wealth. We're doing this interview today. How much does this chair cost? How much would it cost to hire a professor of your standing to do an interview? I can't reduce it down to javelin throws. I can't reduce it down to my ability to spin up an army. Maybe a bit more so rank, but not as much. So as society moves in this direction, it latches on its Amour-Propre to more and more fungible fundamentals. And this enables Amour-Propre to run much more freely in society because everything can be compared. And the other point about its most usefulness to well-being, I think Rousseau perhaps is saying here that it's deceitful. When you make money, you can think to yourself, I'm satisfying amour de soi. I'm building up a fortune for my children. You can do that maybe a bit with rank, less so with power, certainly not with javelin throws. There's something about personal merit when you fetishize it. It's so clearly Amour-Propre that you can't trick yourself into believing otherwise. So these two qualities, that wealth is both the most fungible, also wealth is something you can pursue and you can lie to yourself most easily that you're doing it for amour de soi, for well-being, makes it not just one head of the hydra, but one manifestation, but one that's particularly prone to inflame Amour-Propre.
Yeah, those are two really good points. I agree with them, and I wouldn't have necessarily been able to come up with them myself right now. So the fungibility of money, and it's easier to convince yourself that money is connected to needs, non-relative needs, than class standing, for example. There's one other thing I think I would add to that, which I think is still slightly different. It goes back to the bread and rice example. So this is definitely a Rousseauian point, the hydra point, that if you don't have it here, there've got to be other avenues, other spheres of life in which to pursue recognition. That I think is totally Rousseauian. But as you said, there are certain ways of seeking recognition that are more dangerous than others. That's what you're trying to explain. And one thing about money is that it's, when you measure your worth in terms of money, it's potentially infinite in a way that measuring it in terms of whether you eat rice or bread is not. If you think eating bread raises you above other families who just eat rice, or reverse, there's no real way to get a rat race going, because eating more bread is not gonna do it. It's the fact that you eat bread or the fact that you eat rice. Whereas with money, it's this the potential infinitude of the recognition is, I think, another thing that makes it dangerous.
Okay, and here would be the defense of wealth as the object, which Amour-Propre is pointed to. Surely, when you look around in today's capitalistic society and compare it to, let's say, the gentlemen's wars of the 17th and 18th century, it's great that our most ambitious, inflamed Amour-Propre people are being driven to make products and services from each other, no? The fact that Elon Musk has his Amour-Propre and directed in figuring out new green resources to build cars for me, the fact that Jeff Bezos' Amour-Propre led him to build a button for me to click something and buying goods is much better than them spinning up armies and fighting zero-sum wars, no?
I'm not sure that's true. I'm not going to talk about Elon Musk or about any of the personalities you mentioned, but having the goal of maximizing wealth without there being ethical, social, environmental constraints on how you do that is not a good thing. It may be nice that we have, I don't think it is nice that we all drive cars. I don't drive a car. But many people think that's wonderful. But if the pursuit of profit is what's driving the production of cars, all other sorts of considerations fall out of view, like what are the cars going to ultimately do to our ability to maybe inhabit the planet, for example? So I think it's not quite as simple as you put it.
Well, I'm trying to make a slightly weaker claim here that Amour-Propre directed at wealth is a good thing, a justified thing, but that it seems to be one of the best things we've directed Amour-Propre to, no? Because before that, in the 17th and 18th century, again, gentlemen wars, the way you get prestige is raising some money, conquering someone else. Do you disagree with that weaker claim as well?
I certainly see the point, and I would prefer a commercial society to a warrior society. But again, if a capitalist society, if what Smith called commercial society means pursuit of wealth single-mindedly, without any considerations for what happens to equality or to the destruction of the world we live in, maybe the warriors were better. It's perhaps not relevant to try to compare them. There are downsides to both, and you might be right, but there are certainly real dangers to the unfettered quest to maximize your profits.
So we've talked about all the negatives of Amour-Propre, and in your book, you take a sudden but certainly not unexpected turn to talk about the positives that Amour-Propre makes possible. Let me quote you. The passion to acquire standing in the eyes of others, Amour-Propre, is responsible for much of the richness of human existence. Without Amour-Propre, a large part of what gives human lives meaning and value would be lost. So we've talked about all the ways it can be inflamed, but as you've hinted at already, it's this deeply ambivalent force with a positive side as well. Tell us about some of the deep human goods that wouldn't be possible without Amour-Propre.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to live in a world where human beings were not driven by Amour-Propre. Because, the easiest example to point to is love. If I love someone passionately, my loving them passionately has nothing to do with my hope that loving them will satisfy biological needs. The passion with which I love someone is intimately bound up with wanting to get something from that person and wanting to get love back. I don't understand the scenario where I passionately love someone without it in any way involving my needs for recognition. I Think about how devastating it is when the person you love romantically, passionately, doesn't return your love. It's a feeling of being destroyed again.
Losing existence.
It's a feeling of losing your existence. Your very being has been denied somehow. I think that's a very common feature of romantic love that indicates how strongly the need to be recognized is tied up with our sense of who we are.
So this is another example of a good that is unavailable without amour-propre, and I think it's the most interesting conclusion of your book. Let me read you a quote here. Rationality, morality, and freedom, indeed subjectivity itself, would be impossible if it were not for amour-propre and the relations to other subjects it impels human beings to establish. The reason I think this is such an interesting claim is because classically, we tend to think of reason as standing against, and in some sense, being of a first priority to this social, what Plato called thematic side, right, thumos side, that amour-propre is part of. In the Platonic metaphor, reason is holding the reins. The charioteer, which is reason, is holding the reins, guiding appetite, physical needs, amour de soi, and spirit, amour-propre. But you're suggesting that the charioteer is only made possible by the horse, that it's amour-propre that makes reason even possible. Why is that?
So I think part of the problem with the Platonic analogy is that Rousseau's going to be thinking of reason here in a very different way from the way that Plato is thinking of it there. So the kind of reason that's at issue here in Rousseau is the kind of reasoning you engage in, especially as, but not only, as citizens, when you try to decide what principles should govern your cooperation, your life together.
Right, practical reason.
It's practical reason, ethical reason, reasoning as a political citizen, and so on. But yeah, it's practical reason. And the point is just, I do think this is a really interesting and deep point. It's just that creatures like us could never develop the capacity to take on the perspective of other people, which is what we need in this kind of reasoning. We have to be able to see things from the point of view of others and to take their opinions seriously.
So let me try to draw out this point in a way that's applicable to not just Rousseau's understanding of reason, but also a very general sense of reason.
Right.
I think a common sense understanding of reason is that it's evaluating something from a different normative perspective than the one immediately presented to you, right?
Yeah.
Now, when I act on something immediately, that's appetite, right? The dog shows up in front of me, it's very scary, I fight or fly. The beautiful woman shows up in front of me and I have the sexual urge. But of course, what amour-propre does is also gives me the ability to value another normative authority because I care about the opinions of the other person. And so it's this similar pathway of escaping my immediate normative frame into a separate normative frame and saying, well, what does this phenomenon look like from this other normative frame that reason also co-opts? So it's that shared pathway that makes reason possible. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. So what you're saying is that as creatures of amour-propre, we necessarily give normative weight to the evaluations of others. We think their own evaluations count in some way. And we couldn't be moral reasoners without having that capacity to let the views of others carry normative weight for us.
It's the ability to step out of our normative frame into another one, whether it's another person, amour-propre, or it's a objective standard in the case of reason.
Yeah.
And in this section, I think you drew out a very interesting debate in the history of philosophy between Kant and Smith. And the debate isn't between the lover of vanity, someone who would chase amour-propre regardless of what the activity is. And it's not about the lover of virtue either, which is someone who doesn't really care about Amour-Propre, who just does the good thing, irregardless of the esteem awarded. What they're disagreeing upon is this middle tier of person called the lover of true glory. And that's someone who does the good thing, but only partially because it is the good thing. They also do the good thing because they want to be praised for doing the good thing. Kant thinks that this person is not morally praiseworthy, or it's not a moral act. Adam Smith thinks that it's about as good as we can get in normal moral behavior. Where does Rousseau fall in this dichotomy?
So my Rousseau agrees with Smith. There's something overly demanding about that Kantian view. It's too much to ask of human nature to completely get rid of wanting to be seen by others as virtuous too. Surely everyone believes that there are certain times when you must do what's right, even though no one is going to recognize you for it, and that you must do it then. But I think Smith and Rousseau would think of these as highly unusual situations, and that over the long run, that's not an attitude that we as human beings can really sustain.
And this ties into the motivating question of what goods Amour-Propre makes available, because it suggests that a large part of what makes virtuous activity virtuous is that we desire to be esteemed as virtuous. Is that right?
Right, so that would mean that moral action itself, or moral virtue, let's say, is itself not possible without there being this desire to also be recognized as virtuous. Yeah, I think I agree with that.
So I think we've given a rough sketch already of the problematic, right? It's a very ambivalent sort of idea of Amour-Propre. On one hand, it's responsible for all these potential problems. On the other, human life would be unrecognizable without it. And so I think there's three general responses when we're talking about prescriptions or solutions when you're faced with this problematic. The first response you attributed to the Stoics, right? And this is to say, I'm going to renounce Amour-Propre. I'm not going to care what other people think of me. I'm going to give up my desire for recognition. The second response, you don't talk about this in this book, but I want to talk about with you, is that what I like to call inflame and direct. It's so powerful a force, Amour-Propre. Let's try to inflame it, but direct it towards doing the right thing. The last response is, I think, what you ended up in, and that's what I'll call domestication, right? Figuring out what are the healthy ways that you can tame and mold this drive. So let's talk about the first Stoic option of renunciation. Why is renouncing Amour-Propre impossible?
This is going to sound empirical and psychological to you, and I think it is psychological. It's just not something that human beings can do. It's not something that large numbers of human beings can do, and can do so happily. I'm thinking again, I'm just so moved by that Rousseau, who in his later years was not receiving satisfying recognition. He did everything he possibly could to give up that need, and he couldn't do it. So that's a kind of, I guess, psychological impossibility.
Well, if the argument is going to go to empirical grounds, then I suppose the greatest empirical challenge to this view that I can think of are the existence of Buddhist monastics who engage in solitude for years, if not decades at a time. And what's most notable is that these people in their regular lives, in their civilian life before they became a monastic, are just like us. And so it suggests that there's a deeper need than recognition. It's either due to a lack of being that perhaps Buddhist monastic practice makes whole, or some other psychological unfulfillment that the monastic life helps preserve. So what do you say to the Buddhist monastic who leaves into the forest for 5-10 years and comes back not only not crazy, but happy and satisfied.
So, I don't know enough about Buddhism and Buddhist monks, but your example is meant to show that it's empirically possible. It's probably also very difficult. And the difficulty of achieving this is a testimony to the depth of Amour-Propre in human beings. Maybe talking about Stoics is easier for me than talking about Buddhist monks, because when you read a Stoic text with undergraduates, the very common reaction, which I have to confess to sharing myself, is there's something inhumane to so sever your connections to the world, your attachments to the world, that the loss of your son or your daughter is something you can take over with serenity. So it comes at a cost to attachment to the world.
Right. So you're retreating a bit. You're saying, look, even if it is possible, it's still a very strong position. All of the goods that we talked about that come out of Amour-Propre, whether it's certain virtues, whether it's love itself, become impossible. And that's, I think, a message that I really want this interview to hammer home, about just how deep Amour-Propre runs. In fact, it runs so deep that you describe the Stoic who attempts to do this thing, or a subject who tries to make up her own mind by herself without feeling a need for recognition or approval. That's considered a positive thing in modernity. You described it as inflamed Amour-Propre at its most presumptuous. And I found that such an interesting definition or understanding, because you're pointing to the person who's trying to leave society and saying, your leaving of society is a social act. Your attempting to neglect Amour-Propre is a form of Amour-Propre itself. Why is that?
When I said that, I'm not thinking of someone like the Buddhist monk who really does leave society in a real sense. I was thinking about people who remain in society, but who don't let the opinions of others affect what they take to be true. They completely shelter themselves from any kind of challenge to what they take to be true. And I suppose the reason I said that's the Amour-Propre at its most supreme is that it makes you the king of all. It makes you the sole decider of what's true and what's real. Maybe it would be best to say that's like narcissism at its most intense.
Yeah, so maybe the idea is this: someone who doesn't care about the opinion of anyone, which, by the way, is what modernity wants a lot of people to do, right? The common phrase, the common suggestion is to say, don't care what other people think about you. That's a form of inflamed Amour-Propre in the sense that it's the inflamed self-conception, that I'm such a dominant reasoner, or I'm such a dominant moral judge, that I don't have to take anyone else's opinion into direct consideration. And so the theory of reason, of moral judgment that you're suggesting here is that we're always fallible creatures.
Yeah.
And we need to rely on the opinions of others to act properly. And that caring what other people think is actually a corrective, adaptive mechanism we have as a species.
Right. Yeah. So there's kind of a tension here in this view, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad tension. I think it reflects something real, which is Rousseau too really emphasizes in Émile the virtue of being able to make up your own mind and not being the slave to the opinions of others. And so both of these things have to be there. The person who makes up his own mind has to be a person who seriously takes into account diverging opinions. But at the end, there's a moment where you have to take responsibility for what you take to be true. But as you pointed out, all of that is totally compatible with an attitude of fallibility towards your own reasonings, towards your own conclusions, your own judgments. And this is a very tricky
tension.
Yeah. But I think it gets at something that's right, something that's real about what, being a human being is.
What I really liked about in this book is when you were commenting on a meal, which is Rousseau's great pedagogical work, you were saying that there's two educations that a meal needs. One is man, someone who has this self-esteem, someone who is able to come up with his own opinion, but also a citizen. So man is what we commonly think about in modernity. That's what's praised, being able to think on one's own. But modernity, I think, overlooks the second piece, which is to be citizen. And that's to maybe defer one's opinion to the opinion of the group, or to even see oneself as the group. And the example you give here is Rome. The issue with Rome, however, is that people there are only citizens and not men. Is that right?
In Rousseau's view, yes. And somehow you have to be both. And you're exactly right in how you line up the two things. The citizen is someone, as Rousseau's thinking of it, who thinks of us making judgments about what's good for us, rather than simply my making judgments about what's good for me or good for us even. And somehow both of these things have to be in place. Even in a democracy, we need citizens who are capable of making up their own minds, but still regarding their conclusions, their judgments as potentially wrong, revisable, not the final authority on things.
I want to try one last Stoic path. Clearly, solitary renouncement is not possible, or is not desirable for all the reasons we discussed. Is there perhaps a sort of what we can call Augustinian or a Epicurean option where we retreat from society but with a close group of friends or family? And the idea here would be that you escape all the civilizational hazards that inflame Amour-Propre, but you're able to keep a lot of the benefits of Amour-Propre, such, for example, conjugal love. Rousseau doesn't comment on this option, I don't think. What are your thoughts on whether this is available if the solitary Stoics isn't?
So I'm still against the idea of leaving society with a small group, just because you cut yourself off from too much in the world that's valuable, I think.
Like what?
Theater, riding the subway and having chance encounters with people, millions of things. But you're onto something that I think is really important. And I think you're also right that Rousseau is not thinking about this, but that Hegel does. It's really important that there be these private, maybe semi-public associations where you're together with like-minded people and you're engaged something like, relations of friendship, but it's not exactly friendship. It's like-minded people sharing in common projects and getting really substantial forms of recognition from this way. Hegel thinks about this under the category of civil society, and some political theorists in the 20th century maintain that phrase.
The empirical observation that this called to mind is that whenever I have friends who aren't bound up in these small, intimate groups, whether it's a PhD program, whether it's a group of friends, or it's a reading group, it's a cooking class that meets every week, and they're purely exposed to the logic of society, their amour-propre is almost always inflamed in some way. And perhaps the reason is because it's only in these small and intimate settings can you get to know the person. Whereas
Right.
you can only meet the appearance in society, by definition. You are Fred Neuhouser, Columbia professor, right? I'm Jonathan XYZ. And when you're forced to engage in the public domain only, you're forced to live in the realm of appearance.
Another way of putting at least part of that point would be to say that in these smaller organizations, it's your particularity that's being recognized. You're being recognized as a much more particular person than you are in society or as a citizen of a country.
Right, I see. Let's talk about the second solution. And that's what I called inflame and direct. And so let me try to share this intuition, because I think you're going to be even more hesitant to this than the Stoic option. And that's every single entrepreneur that I've met has some version of inflamed amour-propre. They usually believe, over-exaggerate their own agency, their own place in history, the importance of their company. And obviously, those aren't markers of a successful entrepreneur, but I would say that they're necessary conditions. And lest we conclude that it's only some kind of malfunctioning of capitalism, I would suggest if you read the biographies of all the quote-unquote great men or the world historic figures in the world, whether it's Caesar or Alexander, that they all have some extremely exaggerated notion of both themselves and consequently incredibly inflamed amour-propre. And I want to play on that Rousseau quote, "To this we owe our philosophers and our conquerors." It's not just the conquerors, it's not just the active life like this, but it's also the philosophical life. I don't think Rousseau would have wrote many of the works that he did without an inflamed amour-propre. And perhaps someone like Hegel's, I don't know if you'd consider him as being somewhat of an egoist, but he considered of completing the world's spirit's development through his phenomenology of spirit, so that's at least something, right? So these are two thinkers that you've dedicated your entire life to studying. It seems like their fruits would not be possible without not just amour-propre, healthy amour-propre, but inflamed amour-propre. And let me just make one last observation. Right now we're doing this interview in Europe. I studied with you in America. Compared to Europe, I think you'd agree that America has much more inflamed amour-propre. And because of that inflammation, Europe does not have our errors, but it also does not have our sciences. It has neither our conquerors nor our philosophers. And by the same fell swoop that you would relieve America of her vices, it seems like you would also rob her of her virtues. Why is that a good trade-off to make?
I think, first of all, I think you have a different idea of the virtues of America relative to Europe than I do, but let's not worry about that. Maybe I wouldn't completely disagree with your suggestion that inflamed amour-propre even can have effects that are very beneficial. So I'm granting you that such figures might, even stronger, that certain kinds of greatness might require this form of some version of inflamed amour-propre of the sort that you're describing. I think that in far more cases, these individuals are destructive rather than constructive. And I also think that even the fact that such inflamed amour-propre might be part of real greatness is something we have absolutely no control over. And so no one could possibly reasonably adopt what you're saying as a strategy. Let's inflame and direct. That's not in our power.
So the last attempt I'll make at this, it seems like all the great civilizations had conditions that really inflamed amour-propre, whether it's classical Athens, whether it's Europe in the time of Rousseau, or whether it's America today. It seems like by renouncing this inflammation and direct path, because I agree with you, inflammation means it can't be directed in some sense, you're also giving up a species of greatness, perhaps the greatness of Hegel or Rousseau, and you're saying you're okay with that. You're okay if humanity no longer produces Hegels and Rousseaus.
I don't think I'm saying that because I don't think there's anything we can do I see. You think that the kinds of measures, the kinds of educational measures and social measures that I talk
Yes.
about
Will destroy this type of person. Yes.
I doubt that. I doubt that our measures could ever be so effective that these kinds of megalomaniacs are not going to arise.
Right. So, but let's say hypothetically, you could wave a wand. You could choose one world where the social and educational measures are so effective that these megalomanias never arise, versus a world, the one we're here, where they often arise, sometimes, often, it's very destructive, but once in a while you get a Hegel or Rousseau. Which way would you wave the wand?
Maybe, again, the answer is that here's a kind of tension that needs to be negotiated rather than going simply in one direction or another.
Right, I see.
If I were the father of Elon Musk, I would have tried to make him into a different kind of person.
Right, I see. At the cost of giving us interplanetary travel and green cars.
Definitely. I think we can do without those things.
Right.
I probably wouldn't have succeeded as a father. This is not something you can simply get rid of.
Right.
But on the other hand, you want to enact the kinds of measures in general that I've been talking about to keep this inflamed Amour-Propre from just taking over all of society. In other words, whatever greatness is associated with inflamed Amour-Propre has to really be balanced against the extreme amount of petty, destructive Amour-Propre.
Right. So let's talk about those corrective measures and go to this third solution here, which I've described as domestication or sort of taming. Now, we've talked about all the different social political institutions we can set in place, right? Whether it's alleviating inequalities, whether it's having intimate social associations, or even the importance of the family to provide an important avenue of esteem. But let's talk about something we haven't covered yet, which is the educational measures one can do for their children or for a young child if they don't want that child to develop with the type of inflamed Amour-Propre that we discussed.
I don't think there is an overview of those measures. This is why being a parent, I think, is so difficult, because you don't want to stamp out in your children all desires to be the best, all ambition, as it were. On the other hand, you do want to teach your kids that there have to be some conditions placed on your ambition. But I don't think there's any kind of regime that one can prescribe.
Maybe I'm reading too much of my own interpretation into your work, but it seems like the general principle is before adolescence, before the sexual drive kicks in, and we'll talk about that.
Right.
The strategy is to let's delay Amour-Propre as much as we can. And that's a very different educational regime than what is being operated today. In fact, when I read that part, that the child should only do things he or she wants, or as much as possible, instead of Amour-Propre, I read, oh no. Because my pedagogical strategy up until 15 was extremely competitive. It was almost all about Amour-Propre and one's standing in this sort of social group as a child. So that seems to be like a general principle, right? To delay Amour-Propre as much as possible within the young child, to try to get the child to do as many things to his or her liking because he or she likes it, and not because of Amour-Propre. Is that right?
That's certainly what Rousseau says. I think the idea is that, you get your kids to get interested in doing things that are of genuine interest, that don't always don't always require other people taking interest in what interests them. So, that would be a general principle. But that's not a principle that's going to stifle greatness.
So that's pre-adolescence. And it seems like you agree that the general principle could be interpreted as withhold Amour-Propre as much as possible for the child. When adolescence hits, Rousseau thinks that it becomes very difficult for you to continue using that strategy because of the introduction of the sexual drive. Why does the introduction of the sexual drive, why does it tend to inflame Amour-Propre?
The awakening of sexuality introduces a very passionate element into our Amour-Propre. So whatever manifestations of Amour-Propre Emile, the pre-adolescent, had were much less stormy, turbulent than the kinds of passions that get awakened, bound up with Amour-Propre when sex is in play. And I don't think Rousseau has an explicit answer to this, but I think he thinks that sexuality, the kind of intimacy it leads us to seek, is so close to the intimacy babies and their mothers or caregivers have, that some of that infantile dependence and neediness is just part of the sexual drive. And so it's something like sexuality reawakens that extremely urgent dependence on the mother's love that the baby felt. And now you're right, the need is no longer a need of amour de soi-même. It's a need of amour-propre, especially. But it tends to take on the urgency of the baby's need to have mom all for himself.
Well, there's another interesting fact about the sexual drive, and that is, at least in modern romance, when you seek romantic love, as you said, you seek it exclusionary to others. i.e., in romantic love, we want to be the best because it's all or nothing. And so that logic of romance is so competitive. It might be the most competitive domain, even more than war, because in war, sometimes there's a stalemate, that you're either 0 or 1 in love. And so that could inflame Amour-Propre by making it pursue that type of exclusionary positions in other domains, right?
Okay, but that I think is but that is complementing what I said, because it's another situation in which you require that you be number one for that other specific person that your love is directed at.
Right.
So I think you bring out another facet of this, but that too I think is closely connected with infantile love.
I see. Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for such an engaging discussion.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you understand the most important ideas in history. If you're interested in learning more about Amour-Propre, Rousseau's first discourse provides a perfect example of how Amour-Propre can go wrong, specifically in the domain of knowledge. The thesis of the first discourse is that science and art not only corrupt society, but literally bring about the end of civilization. If you want to know why one of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment attacked the Enlightenment, then go check out my lecture on the first discourse. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.